All right, topic for our first little review session here is virus structure, virus function, the way they work. Um, we all know something about viruses. We've all experienced them in one way or another. But we want to kind of get into their structure today mostly. What you probably have heard about viruses is they're really mostly made out of two things. And there's been the two answers to lots of our questions in this class so far. Protein and DNA or RNA. Those are the two main components of a virus. The protein part, the outside of a virus, is called the capsid. Sometimes we call it a protein coat. So this capsid is their protein coating. It's the outside part of the virus. And then inside that protein coat, there is a nucleic acid. Now remember, nucleic acids are things like DNA, RNA, ATP, and we'll get to some other examples. But viruses, unlike you, they have only one or the other of these molecules. There are DNA viruses and there are RNA viruses. There aren't both. They're one or the other. And that turns out to be real important later. Also associated with that DNA, depending on the virus, there are a few enzymes that they need to work. A few proteins. So basically, we're going to not worry about this envelope part for right now. Mostly what you need to know about viruses is they've got an outer protein coat, called the capsid, and then inside, what they're calling the inner core in this diagram, inside that protein coat is either DNA or RNA, their nucleic acid, and then a few enzymes to help them to function correctly. And those vary depending on the virus we're talking about. Questions there? You guys have heard this before, right? Somewhere along the way? No? Never talked about viruses? All right, first of all, just a couple other basic things about viruses. The word virus means poison. I think it comes from Latin. It means poison. And this phrase here sounds kind of complicated, but this is a good description of what viruses are. Better late than never. Come on in. They are called obligate, you can come around here if you want to. Obligate intracellular parasites. Now look at that term. Every word in there you ought to be able to figure out what it means. We pronounce it in this context obligate, but it really could be pronounced out. Obligate means what? You're obligated to something your way. You have to do it. So they have to be, what do we know this word means now? Inside a cell. And once they're in there, they're parasites. And we know that means what? What does it mean to be a parasite? You benefit and your host is harmed. So that's a good description of what a virus is. First of all, to do anything, it has to be inside a cell. And once it gets inside that cell, it's parasitic. A question we might as well go ahead and deal with now. Are viruses alive? It's kind of controversial, but normally when we talk in biology, usually like in an intro biology class, one of the first things that you talk about when you're in an intro biology class are what are the characteristics of living things? And there's several of them that viruses don't have. One of the main ones is that all living things are made of what? Cells. Viruses don't have cells. So they don't have the cells. Another thing is all living things do metabolism. They use ATP. Viruses don't. They hijack stuff from other cells, but they don't do their own metabolism. And there's lots of other characteristics that viruses really don't have on their own. Are there viruses in this room right now? Probably a bunch of them. What are most of them doing? Just sitting there. They're floating in the air. They're laying on his desk right now. Paige looks interested in this conversation. There's probably some on her piece of paper right now, just laying there. There might be some on Rachel's Alabama shirt over there. You never know. They're everywhere. They're floating around. Let's talk about a particular kind of virus for a second. This is the name for a kind of virus. Now let's look at that word. You ought to be able to figure out what that word means too. Literally, what does it mean? We've been talking about that word a lot with phagocytosis, right? It means eat. Eats bacteria. Bacteriophages are viruses that attack bacteria. Even bacteria can get sick. Bacteriophages are viruses that attack bacteria. It's one of the most simple type of viruses that we know of. Like most viruses, they have a protein coat, the capsid, and they have either the DNA or the RNA. I'm going to come back to this stuff here in a second. First of all, let's just go over some examples of some virus diseases. One of the most famous viral diseases is smallpox. What's maybe most famous about smallpox? Everybody's heard of smallpox before. When was the last known case of smallpox in the world? 70s, like mid-70s, late 70s. Haven't been a case since. How come? Why? Smallpox was the first disease that we made a vaccine for. Who made the first vaccination? What scientist? Pretty famous guy. But he should be really famous because he saved us. He saved a lot of our lives. His name was Edward Jenner. Now Jenner did something that today would have probably gotten him put in jail. He had an idea about how to make a vaccination against smallpox. And guess who he tested it on? His baby. It's like a year or two old, maybe less. He took what he thought would work as a vaccination, injected that into his baby, and then he found a person with smallpox, sucked some fluid out of their smallpox sores, and injected that directly into his child. The child didn't get sick. It's the first vaccination. He probably would have gotten put in jail today for doing that, but it worked. And today nobody gets smallpox largely because of Jenner and what he did. It's pretty important stuff. But smallpox has killed more people than just about any disease out there. Lots and lots of people over the years. Is it still on Earth? It can only live in people. And what we did back in the 60s and 70s is what? They tried to vaccinate everybody. And when there weren't any more people that it could live in, it disappeared. Seems to be gone from Earth. With two exceptions. Where is it still at on Earth? What was going on in the 60s and 70s in the world? Cold War, right? Russia against the United States. Well, our scientists said, hey, what might we be able to do with that smallpox virus? Create a weapon. So they kept some of it. And it's stored, guess where? Atlanta, Georgia. CDC in Atlanta, Georgia. There's a smallpox storage unit there. And the Russians kept some too. We don't know exactly where this is at. Somewhere in Moscow, I guess. And there's always the fear that that could get loose. Because have you guys been vaccinated against smallpox? Oops. I haven't even been vaccinated against smallpox. Just before I was born, they stopped vaccinating people because there hadn't been a case in the United States in a long time. I was born in 71, but the last case in the United States was way before that. The last case in the world, I think, was in 1977, somewhere in Africa, some remote village in Africa. But if someone was to get a hold of that virus and release it, it could be bad. Really, really bad. Anyway, keep going. Polio. That's another common one. What's polio do to you? It can paralyze you. It can paralyze like your legs. What famous historical person had polio? Forrest Gump. He's not exactly who I was thinking about. I was thinking about FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. If you ever see pictures of FDR, you always see the pictures from the waist up, right? Because he couldn't walk, at least not very well, because of polio. And back then, the media was very different than it is today. But back then, the media hid that from the world, that he couldn't walk, intentionally. Because if the president couldn't walk, it kind of makes him look weak. They didn't want that back then. Today, if the president had polio, they'd be showing and falling down and all kinds of stuff, right? Very different. Very different today than it was back then. Another guy that I'll just mention, and the names of these scientists are not so important for you to know for a test or something, but another famous guy developed the polio vaccine. Anybody know what his name might have been? His name is Jonas Salk. He just died a year or two ago. That was a huge vaccination because people would come up with symptoms sort of like a cold. Next day they couldn't hardly move. What else did it paralyze in some people? It turned out to be really bad. Could have killed them eventually if it got paralyzed. Diaphragm, breathing muscle. So that would not be good. AIDS or HIV, obviously is viral. The flu, influenza. Most of the time we don't get all that worried about the flu, right? But if there's something that's going to kill a lot of us in the world today, probably is. Because what does it do very, very well? It mutates and it spreads. Back in 1918, what was going on in the world in 1918? Big historical event, 1918. World War II was ending, right? His soldiers were, World War I, I'm sorry. Get my dates straight. 1914 and 1918, World War I. Soldiers were coming home. And what did they bring home with them all over the world? Flu. They took it home with them. And it was a weird mutated strain of the flu that people hadn't seen, that our immune systems hadn't seen before. How many people died in that 1 year because of the flu? 30 million or so. Way more people than World War I killed. 30 million people. Why did it happen then? The world was a very different place during that time, right? How many people traveled from continent to continent in 1918? Not many. So if World War I hadn't have happened, that probably would have never happened. The reason it spread all over the world was those soldiers took it back home with them and spread it all over the place. That could happen again. Anyone see that new movie, Contagion? Sort of what it was about, right? Very true. I mean, it could happen. Imagine what would happen if some disease just started killing people to the United States. Panic, right? And that, like, for example, the swine flu back a year or two ago. There's people like staying at home and not going to school for a while. And that wasn't even a very serious sickness. Could happen. Kind of scary. Chicken pox is another one. How many of you had chicken pox? More than I thought. Why do most of you not get chicken pox anymore? Most people take a vaccine now. I'm not sure if it's required yet to go to school, but most people take the vaccine. Go ahead. Oh yeah, a lot of people get it anyway. Chicken pox, when you get it as a kid, is typically not very serious. If you get it at my age, it can be really serious. It can kill you. I had a friend who got it during college, and I saw him when he had it. He had sores, chicken pox sores, like all the way down his trachea. He had them all in his mouth. He had them all around his ears, all under his eyes. And it was really terrible. In his nose, he had chickenpox sores. They were everywhere. Would not be a good thing to have as an adult. The cold is viral. Ebola, which hopefully you're reading about in the hot zones. There's an outbreak of Ebola going on in Africa right now, as we speak. What does Ebola do to you? Those of you who started reading that book. It basically destroys your internal organs. And when they do an autopsy on you, and they open you up, there's goo there, basically. Not much left. The virus destroys you. 99 out of 100 viral diseases. If you go to the doctor and you've got a virus disease, what should the doctor typically tell you? Go home. I can't help you. Get some sleep. Get some rest. Then I can do. For most virus diseases, that's true. Will antibiotics kill a viral disease? Absolutely not. Antibiotics are for what? Bacterial infections. All right. No. We know today there are some medicines to treat things like AIDS, right? And those are called antiviral drugs. They're really expensive. And probably not very good for you in the long run. And they typically are not going to give those unless something is really, really bad going around, like AIDS. If there was a flu outbreak, there are a few antivirals they might start giving people to try to stop it. It's a really serious one. But typically, what a doctor should tell you, if you go and you've got a virus disease, go home and rest, drink some fluids. Not much I can do for you. All right, I'm going to go forward for a minute, show you some pictures. Here's some just example viruses. This is a bacteriophage. Notice it sort of looks like some kind of spacecraft or something. All the blue stuff is protein. That's the capsid. And the red stuff in the middle, that's the DNA. Remember, they have either DNA or RNA. Not both. One or the other. Here's another virus. It's called tobacco mosaic virus. Do plants get viruses too? Yep, it's a plant virus. Affects the tobacco plant. Here's the influenza virus, flu virus. Notice it's an RNA virus. We'll talk about the significance of that in a minute. Let's go ahead and look at this picture right here. LYT, LYS. What do we say those meant? Cut, break, split, tear, destroy. The normal life cycle of a virus is called the lytic cycle. It's the normal reproductive life cycle of a virus. Let's forget about this circled part down here for a minute, and let's talk about the way the lytic cycle works. The first thing that happens is a virus attaches to a cell. And most viruses attach to receptors on your cells, receptors for something else. You guys who were in class yesterday, we sort of talked about this with HIV. They use receptors for other things, and that allows them to find a way into your cell. So number one step in the lytic cycle is attachment. The virus, its capsid, attaches to the receptor. Number two, penetration. I want you to think of that virus sort of like a syringe. Because once it attaches, it's going to inject what? What's it going to inject into your cell? It's genetic material. Either it's DNA, if it's a DNA virus, or it's RNA, if it's an RNA virus. And that's what we see going in here. The genetic material is getting inserted. Now again, we're skipping this lysogenic stuff for a second. And go here to step 3. Step 3 is biosynthesis. Once that virus DNA gets into your cell, does your cell know the difference between the virus DNA and your DNA? Nope, it's all DNA. It's the same stuff. It's one of those conserved properties, right? So what does your cell do? Whatever virus DNA says to do. Typically, it says to what? You know, make more viruses. This is the directions for making more viruses. So that's what was going on here. The cell basically gets hijacked by the virus DNA and starts making more viruses. Step 4 here is maturation. All these pieces get put together. Notice you've got the capsids and the genetic material. In step 4, they get put together. And then eventually, the way most viruses work, the cell just fills up with viruses until it what? Until it pops. So we call that lysis. Or in this case, step 5, they call it release. And that's the lytic cycle. So this is how viruses make you sick. They reproduce, 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 kill your cells. How many viruses come out of one sick cell? Hundreds, if not thousands. And all those can go on and infect hundreds to thousands of more cells, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So one thing we'll get to when we talk about the immune system, it's really important for your immune system to be able to what? In terms of this. Your immune system needs to be able to realize when your own cells look like this. And what do they need to do to your cells that look like this? Kill your own cells. There's a whole part of your immune system dedicated to finding your own cells that are sick, killing them. Killing them before they can spread this to some other cell. But that's the lytic cycle. Attach, put in the DNA or the RNA into the cell. The cell starts to make new viruses, biosynthesis. The virus parts get put together in this step, maturation, and then they burst out. They lyse the cell, go to spread more. Now there are some viruses that do this other step. It's called the lysogenic cycle. Notice what will happen with some viruses. And right now we're talking about bacterial viruses. We're talking about bacteriophages. This is a bacteria. Sometimes that viral DNA gets integrated into the DNA of the cell. Notice this was the bacterial chromosome, and now this virus DNA became part of that chromosome. And for long periods of time, it may just stay there and not do anything. It may not cause any symptoms. It just becomes part of your DNA. Every time this cell reproduces, what happens to that piece of virus DNA? It gets reproduced. It's called the prophage. What does that mean, prophage? Break that word apart. Prophage. What would that mean? Now, what do we know phage means? Eating, and pro means before. Before the eating, right? Before this happens. And it just stays there, sometimes for generations, for long periods of time, not doing anything. There are several viruses that can get into people like this. Anybody know of a virus that you can get and the symptoms go away, and then sometimes years later it shows back up? Chickenpox. Once you've had chickenpox, that virus is in you in a form similar to this. You never get rid of it. And it can come back years later as an adult as another completely different disease called shingles. Have you ever seen anybody with shingles? Right now? Wow. Tell us the symptoms.
Scratching bumps and cycles. It's just like, I guess it's in our nerves or something because it feels like hot. Like our back's hot.
Yep, it's in the sores are mostly on our back. So you usually get sores along your back, and it gets in the nerves in your body, and it's really painful. And it feels, the best way I could explain it, having never had it, you know, if you hit your funny bone really bad, that burning sensation you get in your hand, I think that's sort of what it feels like all up and down the back. Really, really painful burning. And that virus never goes away. It's always with you. What usually triggers it to come back? Stress or some kind of other sickness. A lot of times somebody will get shingles and they find out later when they go to the doctor that maybe they've got HIV or maybe they've got some kind of cancer or some kind of something that's making their immune system give up. Most of the time it's just stress related. But it's something that weakens your immune system and therefore that virus comes back. What's another disease? It works that same way. Hopefully you don't know about this one. Now AIDS they think is always trying, but that our body successfully fights it for a while.
But can it be passed on from a mother to her offspring to breastfeeding?
Yeah, it can be passed on. But what I'm saying, any virus can be passed on just about that way. I'm saying it never really goes into hiding the HIV virus. It's just they think today that our bodies just successfully fight it for a while, and then eventually it wins. But these viruses basically just go into hiding. And I heard Rachel say the other one, herpes, the STD. People get symptoms, and then they go away. Sometimes months, sometimes years later, they show back up. And once you got herpes, it never goes away. It's always there, always in hiding. And that's what lysogenic cycle is. It's when a virus, its DNA becomes part of the host cell's DNA. And it basically sometimes just sits there. It's just part of the DNA. Every time that cell reproduces, the DNA gets reproduced. Something along the way will trigger the virus to go from the lysogenic cycle back to where? Back into the lytic. Before the eating, and then you get the eating. And that's when the symptoms show back up. It's when it gets back up in here and it starts destroying your cells. Does that make sense? All right, let me backtrack for a minute, man. Actually, let me go ahead and mention these terms while we're here. These are several terms you're going to hear a lot in the hot zone as you're reading it. What's a pathogen? Say again? Somebody said it. Was it you, son? What did you say? Pathogen is anything that can make you sick. Could be a virus. What other things might be considered pathogens? Bacteria? Keep going. What other things can make you sick? Viruses, bacteria, fungi, certain fungal infections. Keep going. You don't hear a lot about it in the United States. There's all kinds of worm infections. People can get all kinds of worms. And we'll spend some time talking about some of those worm infections one morning in here before too long, actually. Some really gross stuff in terms of worm infections. There's also some protist-caused diseases, like amoebas can make you very sick. Maybe anybody know the most famous disease that amoebas can cause? Dysentery. You guys ever heard of dysentery? Really, really bad diarrhea that you can get from like drinking water that hasn't been purified. All right, what's an epidemic? It's an outbreak of a disease in a local area. So maybe we had an epidemic of the flu at Buckhorn. It's an outbreak of a disease in a local area. What's a pandemic? It's a worldwide outbreak of some kind of disease. Like the flu pandemic of 1918. HIV pandemic. Worldwide outbreak of disease. This word right here is probably one you never heard of before. What does the root trans mean? Say again? Across. What do you think in terms of viruses? Why are we saying across something? What across multiple species? Transduction is the idea that a virus can transmit genes from one species to another. How is it infecting you? It's injecting its DNA into your cells. And what did we say sometimes happens to that DNA? It becomes part of your DNA. There are a lot of scientists who think that viruses are really important for evolution because they can inject DNA from one thing and sometimes they can transfer it to another thing. That's kind of weird. A lot of your DNA may have originally been virus DNA. Kind of cool. But the idea that a virus can transfer DNA genes from one species to another. That's kind of cool stuff. All right, I want to talk about, lastly here. Let me put up a blank slide for a second. You guys should know the idea of the central dogma of genetics. What's a dogma? Yeah, it's like a main idea. So this is the main idea of genetics. And basically, it looks like this. That every living thing has DNA. And we know that DNA's only job is to what? Code for proteins. But the DNA we know is in the nucleus. And it's stuck there. So to be able to make proteins, the DNA is first used as a template for making what? What's made from the DNA first? Messenger RNA, right? mRNA. That process to go from DNA to RNA is called transcription. Marker's a little off, I guess. That's transcription. The marker's way off. And then the RNA leaves the nucleus and goes to where? The ribosomes, where it's used to make protein. And that process we call translation. And those proteins then go on to determine what about you? Everything is one way we might say it. I'm just going to say it determines your traits. That's the central dogma of genetics. And as far as we know, every living thing on Earth, from bacteria to protists to fungus to plants to animal, they all do that exactly the same way. That's one of those conserved properties. Every living thing does it. But viruses aren't really living. Turns out most viruses do this too. But there's one category of viruses that are called retroviruses. And they're the exception to this rule. They're RNA viruses. And what did we just get through saying about DNA and RNA in a virus? It's only got one or the other. They only have RNA. So they've got an extra step here. When they inject that RNA into the host cell, they have to start with RNA. And what else did we say is inside a virus other than the DNA or RNA? What kind of proteins? Enzymes. Retroviruses in particular have this enzyme that's only found in them called reverse transcriptase. Guess what reverse transcriptase does? It turns RNA into DNA. It goes backward. What's retro mean, by the way? If you go retro, you go what? You go back. Like retro, you might refer to the 70s as retro, right? You go back. So you're going backward. Retroviruses start with RNA, and they use that reverse transcriptase to turn their RNA into DNA. And then what does that DNA do inside the cell that they just injected it into? Well, it becomes part of the host cell's DNA, and then they use it to do all this other stuff and eventually make virus proteins. So you should know right now that retroviruses, RNA viruses, are exceptions to the central dogma of genetics. They've got an extra step. Another thing we'll mention about RNA viruses. RNA, how's it different than DNA? It's one strand instead of two. With DNA is pretty stable. It doesn't do what very often? It doesn't mutate because the two strands have to fit, right? And if one of the strands get messed up, they don't fit with the other one. So DNA viruses, they don't mutate very often. Some examples of DNA viruses we just mentioned: smallpox, polio, and there are lots of others. How long have we had these vaccines for smallpox and polio? A long, long time. This one over 100 years. This one, 50s maybe. I'm guessing since maybe the 1950s. Point is, those viruses, the same vaccination still works because they don't mutate very often. How often do they have to remake the flu vaccine?
Very often.
Every year, and it still doesn't work lots of times, right? They're guessing, because the flu vaccine is what kind of, the flu virus, on the other hand, is what kind of virus? It's a retrovirus. It's an RNA virus. It mutates constantly because it's just that single strand. And it's hard for us to make a vaccine against those. What other famous virus is an RNA virus? HIV. When did they first figure out, doctors, scientists, what HIV was? Actually, it's in the 80s. I was a young kid when they figured out what HIV was. And what were they saying about vaccinations back then? Give us about 10 years, we'll have this figured out, we'll have a vaccination. Well, that was a long time ago, 20, 30 years ago. What are they saying today about HIV and a vaccination? Give us about 10 years, we'll have it figured out, we'll have a vaccination. Because it continues to mutate. One person who has HIV, how many different HIV virus types might be in them? Thousands sometimes. And if they could make a vaccine against one HIV virus without a problem. But it wouldn't work. It would work against that one, but it wouldn't protect you from everything. What else? What other virus that we've talked about is a retrovirus? Ebola. You'll start reading about that, hopefully. And one that you've all had before. And you've probably all had it before because it's one of these. The common cold virus. Anybody know what the more scientific name for the common cold virus is? Probably heard it on TV commercials if you're paying attention. It's called the rhinovirus. There's other versions too. What's rhino mean? Nose. You catch it through your nose. It's the way you catch flu too, right? Back in the 1918 outbreak of the flu, there's pictures of a lot of people, and they were walking the streets. What did they have covered up? They had their mouth covered up. How you catch the flu? Through your nose. They didn't know. Scary, scary, scary stuff. But those are, just realize for right now that RNA viruses are going to mutate more often. And therefore, they're really probably more dangerous to us. A DNA virus we can handle. We can make a vaccine against it. It may take a little while to make that vaccine, but we can eventually control it. RNA viruses, not so much, because they mutate so fast. All right, that's a good place to stop. One strand, and it's easier to mutate.